Hello, everyone. Welcome to the IISS. We're delighted here to welcome Graham Allison today. My name is Ben Rhode. I'm a senior fellow here at the Institute. Graham, I'm sure, needs no introduction to anyone here, but I will nonetheless introduce him. He's the Douglas Dillon Professor of Government at Harvard University, where he has taught for 5 decades. He was the founding dean of the Kennedy School of Government, and until 2017, he served as the director of the Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs. As Assistant Secretary of Defense in the first Clinton administration, Graham has the sole distinction of having twice been awarded the Distinguished Public Service Medal. One of these awards was for reshaping relations with Russia, Ukraine, Belarus, and Kazakhstan to reduce the former Soviet nuclear arsenal. He served on the advisory boards of every Secretary of Defense, from Caspar Weinberger to James Mattis, as well as those of the Secretary of State and the Director of the CIA. His most recent book, Destined for War, Can America and China Escape Thucydides Trap, was a US and international bestseller, as was his 2013 book, Lee Kuan Yew, The Grand Master's Insights on China, the United States, and the World. Graham's first book, Essence of Decision, Explaining the Cuban Missile Crisis, ranks amongst the all-time bestsellers with 500,000 copies in print, which incidentally was originally his PhD thesis, which I think is inspiration to anyone who's done a doctorate. Graham was educated at Davidson College, Harvard College, Oxford University, and Harvard University. He has a legion of former employees, students, and mentees, many of whom are in the highest reaches of government around the world. I recall I first worked for Graham 10 years ago, which was a remarkably formative experience for me and a privilege. I remember speaking to one of his former employees a few years ago, who I think at that point was the chief of staff to the Pentagon, and on about 3 hours of sleep a night. And he said, Graham still gives me assignments and I still complete them. Anyway, a little bit of housekeeping. Graham is going to speak for, I think, about 30 minutes, maybe 40 minutes, and then we'll move on to Q&A. We have a couple of IISS colleagues with us here in the room, and we have a very sizable online audience. So if you do have a question you'd like to ask Professor Allison, please raise your digital hand, so to speak, and we will do our best to come to you. You may also type a question into the online chat, which we'll be able to see, and hopefully we'll be able to answer as many questions as possible. With that, I'll turn over to Graham.
Thank you very much, Ben, and thank to John and IISS for hosting me here in London. I've been a fan of the IISS and learned from it over many, many decades. And as a member, I read your work. I'm proud that an alumni of the Belfer Center, Ben Rhode, is playing a key role here. And thank you for hosting me today. So basically, the topic today is a combination of the Russian-Ukraine war, which I think, unfortunately, we all are looking at everything through as a lens, but nonetheless is certainly the most urgent issue of the day. The US-China rivalry, which is, I think, the greatest challenge of the era and will be for the rest of everyone here's professional life. And Thucydides Trap, which is, I think, the greatest danger that we face, and about which I wrote in Destined for War. Let me begin with 3 bottom lines up front, then I'll take you through about a dozen slides, and I'd be more interested in the conversation and discussion than in the presentation. I was talking to my old professor, Henry Kissinger, who's going to turn 99 next month. This was on Saturday, because he and I have co-organized a seminar or a little working group trying to understand whether it's possible to develop some constraints on the advance and application of AI that might have the most catastrophic consequences, and thinking about the nuclear analog and lessons from the nuclear history. And so among other things, though, we were chatting about the fact this is the 50th anniversary of Nixon Kissinger trip to China and basically the opening to China. And I said, Henry, you're thinking back on it. What would you say about where we are now? And he said, and here's the quote, he said, well, if the US and Chinese relationship proceeds totally autonomously and with us increasingly seeing each other as enemies, he thinks a catastrophic outcome is highly likely. And this is for somebody that's been worrying about this relationship for a long time. Well, that actually is the first bottom line, which is a takeaway from the Thucydides Trap book. In that book, written in 2016, I say about US-China relations, expect things to get worse before they get worse. And I think if Thucydides were watching today, he would say both the rising power and the ruling power are exactly unscripted. Actually, they seem to be competing to see which can better exemplify the role of the classic rising power or the classic ruling power. And he's sitting on the edge of his seat, anticipating the greatest collision of all times. So that's not an encouraging conclusion, but I think that's the first bottom line. Secondly, the Putin's war against Ukraine. In this war, however brutal, however outrageous, however horrific, will China continue to have Putin's back, continue to support him? And if you've read what I've written about it, the answer is yes. Now, why and the circumstances, we may want to discuss that more, but the second bottom line is count on China to side with and support Putin and Russia through a war, however brutal. I'm afraid even if it comes to Putin's use of tactical nuclear weapons on a target in Ukraine. And the third, I was asking Ben whether this is an acronym here in London, and he said not yet, but in the US now, GOAT is the new internet or web word, GOAT, which stands for greatest of all times. So Tom Brady as the quarterback for the Patriots, but unfortunately now for the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, is the greatest quarterback of all times. And I would say the GOAT rivalry, that is the greatest of all times rivalry, is what we're now seeing between a rising China and a ruling US. China is a meteoric rising power, risen further faster in more dimensions than any power in history. And the US is a colossal ruling power that has basically orchestrated the international order for now more than 7 decades since World War II. So the impact of a rising China on a ruling US and the international order, of which the US has been the principal architect and guardian, is the dynamic that defines international politics today and will for the foreseeable future. And again, if Thucydides were watching, he would say, most often this turns out in war, most often. Not inevitably, but most often. So, point one then, Putin's war against Ukraine and the China angle. There's lots to be said about Putin's war in Ukraine. I'm happy to go into that in the discussion, at least my view about the confusion that we're all trying to cope with. But the piece of this that I think has been, or one piece that has been largely misunderstood, but which I believe I have a handle on, is the Chinese dimension. In Washington, this has been a big debate because most people in Washington still cannot accept the fact that Xi has built with Putin's Russia a functional alliance that is operationally more significant than most of US treaty alliances. That is, the operational consequences of Russia-China is greater than the operational consequences of, for example, the US and India, which is a member of the Quad, and maybe the US and most of its formal treaty alliances. In order to try to make this, the reason why this matters is Washington and everybody else was thinking about the question, well, what will China do if Putin invades Ukraine? I offered my view, which was they will have Putin's back. And in order to make this vivid, I said, okay, I'll produce the briefing chart that Xi's staff will provide to him before the February 4th meeting between Putin and Xi in Beijing at the beginning of the Olympics. This was made up completely from whole cloth. There's no classified information in this briefing chart. But nonetheless, so I produced one chart which says advantages for China if Putin invades, and then a second chart called disadvantages for China, because obviously there's a balance here. And I said, when you look at this, actually I have some backup slides for each of them, but for today I'll just show you the first slide of advantages and the first slide of disadvantages. Looking at that, I think Xi will stick with Putin. So can we go to the next slide? So apologies for this being rather full, but this was written for Chairman Xi's eyes only. So this is classified Chinese made up by me. So this is fictional. Okay? And I start bluff with the bottom lines up front, the killer advantages. So the first 10 reasons why I'm in favor of this from the perspective of China is that the US will not be focused on us. What does China want most from the US in the world? Benign inattention. Fortunately, the US system can only focus on one issue at a time. The longer the Russian threat to Ukraine and Europe consumes US attention, the longer the breathing space for China. And as a staffer to Xi, I reminded him that we already had this debate after 9/11, when people said, oh my God, Islamic terrorism is going to be a terrible threat to everybody, and we have a bunch of Muslims. And others said, wait a minute, once the Americans get sucked down that rabbit hole, they won't think about us. And that was 20 years ago, and it worked out rather well. So that's my first 10 reasons, and I could go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Now, how about 11 to 15? 11 to 15 is, and again, if Putin is able to cause American military planners to rebuild NATO, to send troops to develop, to create support for NATO members, to focus on the possibility that Putin might even attack somebody else, that creates the prospect of a two-front war if ever we should have to do anything about Taiwan. And we're not about to do something about Taiwan today, but if Taiwan takes an ambiguous move towards independence, we will seize Taiwan. And if we were to do so, the more the Americans have to think about dividing their forces along two fronts, the better it is for us. And thirdly, the current alliance with Russia has largely been the making of the chairman's brilliance. So Xi has done this through brilliant diplomacy. But this will institutionalize Russia's role as a vassal state, basically providing natural resources for us. So there's 20 good reasons why this is good for China. Now, on the other hand, next slide, please. We shouldn't neglect the fact that this is also disadvantageous for us. And the first is that it blatantly violates the fundamental concepts we say are ours and we subscribe to for international order. In particular, independence and territorial integrity. So however our Foreign Office spins this, it'll be impossible to give an account of why this is consistent with our basic principles. And if you look at the new Chinese ambassador to Washington's recent op-ed in the Washington Post, it's an exercise in, I don't know, wiggling, but it basically is a failure. It tries to explain why black is white. It doesn't quite work. Secondly, the precedent. If the precedent here is somebody who thinks they could be independent, separatists, declare independence, and then they're recognized by some other state, and then that state sends forces to help support them. Wait, that doesn't sound like that sounds like not what we want in Taiwan, not what we want in Xinjiang. And then finally, this is going to provide an occasion for Americans to say that we're just like the Russians, and that this is another version of the bloc or some other such thing. So this will be negative for people in Washington who are trying to promote a Cold War mentality, as we say. So there's good reasons to be for, there's good reason to be against. If you look at the actions China has taken in the period since the invasion, every one of them is consistent with having concluded that the advantages outweigh the disadvantages. And while there'll be a lot of cosmetics, and there'll be even more, I think, as the atrocities mount, in order for China to appear not to be heartless and to be sympathetic. And I've even written, I think if I were advising Xi, I would say, you've gotten what you want. Now, why don't you be the peacemaker? So I wrote with Fred Hu in the Post last week about the possibility they take a page out of Teddy Roosevelt's book and try to be the mediator. That's what I would do if I were playing Xi's hand, but I don't think they'll do that. So that's once over lightly on Russia invades China. Let me turn now to the next slide, which is the US-China relationship. I was saying to Ben at lunch, we have at Harvard, our China working group, just finished the third of 3 reports on the great rivalry between US and China. First report was on the great military rivalry. The second was on the great technology rivalry. This third one that's just been published is the great economic rivalry. The fundamental point of each of them is that over the period of, well, actually the assignment to which each of them responds, these were transition memos for the new administration, is summarize the facts about what's actually happened in the first 21 years of the 21st century. So we start with, here you are in 2000, and then we review all the evidence about what's happened between the 2 competitors, between them and 2021. And in effect provide what would be in the US government terms, a net assessment. Here's where blue was, here's where red were, here's where they are now. And basically the takeaway from all of them is that a country which the US could not find in our rearview mirror 20 years ago, because they were so far behind, we can today not find in our rearview mirror because they're beside us or sometimes a little ahead of us. And this across the spectrum, economic, technological, military, diplomacy chapter is yet to come, the systems rivalry yet to come. So economic, the fundamental point is there's been a tectonic shift. This was a slide from Destined for War, which I made for John McCain when he was chairman of the Senate Armed Services Committee. This is back in 2014, in which they were trying to understand Obama's so-called rebalancing or pivot to Asia. And I said, the theory of the case is a good one. We should put less weight on our left foot in the Middle East fighting wars in order to put more weight on our right foot in Asia, where the future lies. But we should also notice that while this discussion's going on, if you think about the balance of power as a seesaw, with on a children's playground, and one party's on one side and one's on the other, then in 2004, China was about 40% of US GDP. And in 2014, it was about equal. That's using purchasing power parity, which is the metric that the IMF and the CIA both believe is the best single metric for comparing national economies. And by 2024, it's going to be 40% larger than the US on the current trajectory. So basically, we are arguing about whether more weight on the left foot or right foot, but actually the seesaw is moving so that both feet are dangling off the ground. So the tectonic shift in the economic relationship is profound and fundamental. Next slide. So in 1940, a famous senator from Kansas said, our objective is to lift Shanghai up and up and up until it becomes just like Kansas City. And I think we succeeded. Yes. Next slide. So how long can this go on? The future is obviously uncertain. Yogi Berra said, don't make predictions about the future. If you were betting, will China continue growing at twice the rate of the US? And the answer is, most people's projections, US will grow just less than 2%, and most people's projections, China will grow a little more than 4%. The answer is yes. So the question here is not, is China's growth slowing? The question is the relative growth of the two parties, if you're thinking about a rivalry. Next slide. So let me go back a second. Can we back up one? So basically, on this point, just to remind you, in the economic rivalry, China, which was 20% the US GDP in the year 2000, is 115% today by purchasing power parity, and it'll be 140%, 150% before the end of the decade. So you've had this tectonic shift in what is ultimately the substructure of power. Now, where does that reflect, or where do you see it reflected? You see it reflected everywhere. You see it reflected in who's the manufacturing workshop of the world. Beginning of the century, US. 2021, China. Who's the major trading partner of everybody? Beginning of this century, US. 130 countries today, including EU, China. Japan, China. Australia, China. Singapore, China. Everybody, China. So go across that whole spectrum. And in technology, similarly, as compared to historically, where you would say in the competition with the Soviet Union, other than in a few military technologies, they didn't really compete. In the technology space, again, China has become a full spectrum beer competitor. So let's go to technology here for a second. So one thing in which CIA Director Bill Burns and Xi Jinping agree fully is that the main arena for competition and rivalry today is technology. As Xi says, this has become the main battleground on the global playing field. So how are we doing? Next slide. So 2 years ago at Facebook, people in the board reviewed risks to Facebook, systemic risks. Well, all of them were in Washington. They're going to regulate us. They're going to maybe split us up. One thing that was not on their screen was a Chinese startup called TikTok. But a month ago, in a single day, when it was discovered that, or reported, that TikTok actually has more visitors who spend more time than Facebook, Facebook's value dropped by a quarter. So that's, I think, I remember, was like $20 billion. So a big deal, a really big deal for Facebook and for Zuckerberg. So I think, who is going to be the great disruptor technologies across the spectrum now? Chinese companies like TikTok, I think. Next slide. AI, which is the topic, as I mentioned, that Kissinger and I have been trying to explore, even though I think we compete on which one has the thinnest understanding of what the hell is going on. But fortunately, Eric Schmidt is a very patient tutor, so he's been trying to help us both with this. But in the AI applications, as the paper Schmidt and I wrote last year says, facial recognitions, China wins every contest. Voice recognition, including in English, China wins every contest. Comprehensive surveillance, China wins every contest. Machine reading, China wins the gold. So basically in the AI space, which is the technology that will have the biggest impact on economy and security in the next 20 years, China is a full spectrum competitor. Fortunately, in the most, for the most AI super talents, the US still has the highest concentration. And DeepMind here in London, that built AlphaGo, is one of the most impressive. They were bought up by Google. So Google has been, and Eric, when he was the chairman of Google, have been very aggressive in buying up talent wherever they can find it. But the Chinese are doing quite a good job. Next slide. This one is the one that drives me completely crazy. So I'll try to be brief about it, but I become passionate. Europe was a leader in 3G. US took the lead in 4G. 4G was a world in which ultimately were smartphones, social media, Google, Uber. So all sorts of things you couldn't have imagined with 3G, you could imagine with 4G. 5G will be equally consequential. 5G in the US is a fake, essentially a fake. In fact, Eric and I wrote a piece called American 5G Deserves 5 Fs. They spend more time and more money advertising 5G, but they don't deliver 5G services. So in Boston, on your 5G phone, which is 5G enabled, you get 50 megabits or 40 megabits of speed. In China, you get 300. So unless you're going to take your smartphone to Beijing or Shanghai, it's doing nothing for you, except it's enabled. And I don't know, I haven't looked at the London speeds and what's happening here. But with respect to the US and China, poor for the US. So in terms of users, 10 times as many. In terms of base stations, 10 times as many. In terms of band share, 10 times as many. So in terms of rollout, why and what to be done about it, a whole nother topic. But this is an arena where people now living, 150 million Chinese in a 5G environment, will be inventing things that you and I can't think of, and especially in the Internet of Things. Next slide, please. This is just the last part. So back to the Thucydides Trap and the case file. This is a chart from the book. The book looks at the last 500 years of history, finds 16 times a rising power threatened to displace a ruling power. So basically, Thucydides wrote about this for classical Greece as the rise of Athens impacted Sparta. But when Spain rose to challenge Portugal at the time of Christopher Columbus, right through to the Cold War with the US and the Soviet Union, or even the stretch case is the 16th, Germany as it's become the dominant power in Europe, normally the outcome of this is war, often catastrophic war. And Ben actually wrote about this in your thesis. You looked at the 1890s and what was happening, in the European scene. So 12 of the 16 cases war, 4 not war. So war inevitable, of course not. I mean, just on the record, 4 cases in which not. The compelling challenge, therefore, I think now for all of us is to try to find a way in which what will inevitably be the fiercest rivalry we've ever seen can nonetheless be managed without war. And I've been exploring these sort of how to escape Thucydides Trap for the 6 years since I sent the book off to the publisher. I found 9 possible avenues of escape. None of them seem compelling. I just conclude with the proposition my current best understanding of this, and I think the Biden team has been working their way through this, and I think when their strategy's rolled out, you'll see a version of this, is that one's got to hold 2 contradictory imperatives in our head at the same time, 2 contradictory demands. On the one hand, this will be the fiercest rivalry anybody ever saw, and it matters who wins. So I'm very competitive about the rivalry. That's on the one. On the other hand, unless the US and China can find ways to constrain that competition and even coordinate their behavior in a number of arenas dealing with global challenges, including climate, where we lived in an enclosed biosphere, including avoiding a war that could become a nuclear war, including pathogens like viruses that don't have passports and don't observe borders. Unless we can find ways to coordinate and even, could you even say cooperate in constraining the competition. Now, can you hold 2 contradictory ideas in your head at the same time and still function? F. Scott Fitzgerald, who wrote The Great Gatsby, said the test of a first-class mind is to hold two contradictory ideas in your head at the same time and still function. So I think that's the challenge for the U.S. and China going forward. And I hope the answer is yes. I hope that some younger folks like you put their mind on this, because it seems to me that the previous generation has not done a very good job of addressing this challenge. So maybe that's enough for once ever lightly.
Thank you so much, Graham. Kind of tour de force, as I would expect you for this, all these questions. And you've laid out a lot of very compelling challenges, and I'm intrigued by this, I don't know, this kind of strategic dialectic perhaps of the opposing things at the same time. I'm sure there are lots of questions from our online audience. I will ask actually one or two myself and abuse my position as the chair. And I may have a couple of IISS colleagues in the room who may also want to pose questions. But to start off with, I mean, when we were having a discussion earlier, I came away with the conclusion of we're facing some very stark challenges. Say if we're sitting in Washington looking at the China challenge, and now particularly with the Russia dynamic as well. I suppose I'd be interested in hearing more about what should we do given these challenges. Which is not an easy question to answer. I think if anyone had easy answers, then they would be apparent. So I'll ask that question on two levels. One of them is broader kind of geopolitical. For some years, certain people have been arguing that what Washington should attempt to do is, for instance, to reverse Kissinger, i.e. So detach the Russians from the Chinese and move them towards us on our side of this greatest competition of all time. That now seems, if it was possible beforehand, it now seems a lot less likely. And if you agree with that, how do we play the kind of chessboard given the current pieces that are on the board? Second question, thinking about the war itself, what is your view, if you're sitting in Beijing, what conclusions from the war so far would you take away that would... What impact do you think they have on whether an attempt to seize Taiwan by force is more or less likely, say, in the next 5 to 10 years? I have many, many other questions, but I'll restrict myself to those two for now.
Thank you. Both big questions, and as I say to the students in my class, and I try to remember to say to myself, if you're not slightly confused, you haven't been watching carefully. And if you're very confused, you probably have. So anybody who has clarity in the midst of the current confusion, I think is basically not, they sort of tuned out. So they remember what they knew from before, they say that over. Unfortunately, that's the commonplace among old people. Since I've become older, I'm conscious of that as a danger. So I would say this is my current best view, but I'm also confident that I am wrong about some things, and I can't always tell which ones I might be wrong about. I think the first thing about the impulse that recognized that the budding alliance between Russia and China was in some ways unnatural. Well, this is an argument I've had linked with Jim Mattis. He kept saying this cannot be happening. Even still I mean, we talked about it a few weeks ago, and he said, well, maybe I'm weakening. But this is so unnatural, and it's so ahistorical. These are, as he calls them, natural adversaries. If you look at their history, you look at their interests. So how can this be happening? To which he answers, Spig Brzezinski explained this in the last year of his life, and I wrote about it in a piece. He called it the alliance of the aggrieved. So if the U.S. attempts to isolate and ostracize both of the parties, it actually appears to be attempting to undermine the regime of each of the parties, even to overthrow each of the leaders. Well, excuse me, international politics, the enemy of my enemy is a friend. So the U.S. has played a significant role in helping this unnatural alliance. That's the first point. Secondly, she has been brilliant in building it. If you look at the relationship, and again, I've written about this in a piece in the National Interest, if if you look at how many times, who was the first person that she went to visit after he became president? Putin. Who the only leader ever celebrated Putin's birthday with them? She. How many times have they met? 38 times. How often do they talk? All the time. What do they talk about? About these foreigners who are trying to undermine our good regimes, about these guys that are trying to overthrow us. Now, and how are they cooperating? In every way. Look at the intelligence sharing, look at the military sharing, look at the economic planning, across the spectrum. So I would say, now, would a wise U.S. policy have sought to weaken this and encourage the cracks the way Kissinger did in the trial? Of course. And I think we would be much better off to try to highlight concerns in Russia about China. Whether you could do this with China about Russia, I don't know. But in any case, I would, if I were playing the Washington hand, try to persuade the Chinese they've hooked themselves to a loser, that Putin is a loser, okay? And I believe he is. But she would probably say, well, excuse me, he's my son of a bitch, and so I got to deal with him, the best I can. And I think particularly after Ukraine, this hope that people have been working on becomes much less likely. I think Russia will be, if things go on the current trajectory, locked into China in a dependency. And she's been brilliant in managing Putin's psychology to let him feel comfortable as a junior partner, which is very hard for a Russian who's thinking about Great Russia and thinks of China in a somewhat racist fashion. So, secondly, big question on war and how do they make of it so far. Again, I tried, as I did in that slide, and I do this, I go to Washington every week because most of all the people playing the hands are either former students or colleagues or friends. So I try to be helpful, okay? But I make myself a bit of a pain in the ass because I say, do not tell me what you think Chinese should be thinking or what Chinese should be seeing. Go get your intelligence folks to tell you what are people talking about privately. But get the best you can, the best information you can. I'm not reading most of that information now, but I talk to Chinese whom I know reasonably well, some of whom are fairly well connected. And I think they're looking at this and saying, obviously the Russians performed a little worse than we thought they would do at the outset. So I got to have some disappointment in that. The Chinese study war way more seriously than we do. So they studied our wars in the Middle East in detail, fine detail. Bob Work, the former deputy secretary, has been very explicit about that if you look at the things that he's said and written. So they're studying this and watching and seeing, what are the Ukrainians doing? Was it really a Ukrainian Neptune missile that sunk the Moskva? I don't think so. I think that probably there's some American or somebody else's, how in the world have so many Russian generals been killed? By Ukrainian intelligence? I don't think so. So they know that there's a bunch of stuff happening behind the scene here. And I think they got to be worried. I was thrilled with the sinking of the Moskva. So now I'm planning an invasion of Taiwan. Well, how about my ships? I mean, if I'm going to try to deliver them for an amphibious landing, if the Ukrainians can have missiles that can sink ships, could the Taiwanese? I think they could. Well, do they? Well, I don't know. So, I mean, if I, again, playing the American hand, I would say that Taiwanese should be building up their forces, and they should have been doing this anyhow, as fast as they could. So I think this will probably, I hope, provide some reason for both the PLA, which is inherently conservative, like most militaries. So they want always more resources and more time to train. Good. So they should spend their time training and preparing. And for the Chinese leadership to say, I'm a little less comfortable about having to do something. Now, I hope, since I've thought that the likelihood that China would act independently to seize Taiwan, very low, at least for the foreseeable future. But that the likelihood that if the Taiwanese made a unambiguous move towards independence, Xi's hand would be forced. So I think there's a risk that Tsai or the government, especially as they go into the 24 elections, may be tempted to do something, a little reckless. And I hope not. And so I think the U.S. has been trying again, and I think private people have been saying to them, look, you never have had such a good situation as you have now. Sustain it. Don't try to, but I hope watching this war, and I think it's likely, but I don't know, that the Chinese are having some second thoughts.
Thank you, Graham. Very interesting. I know that my colleague Dana Allen, who's the editor of Survival, our journal, had a question, if it's still pertinent.
Yes. Well, first,
Nice to see you. Yeah.
nice to see you again. Thank you, Professor Allison. I think you've covered this at least implicitly, but I just want to bring you back over. You had your slide with the briefing to President Xi with sort of advantages and disadvantages of the relationship with Russia. And I can't remember if that was, those slides were imagined to be written after the war started.
No. This was given to people in the U.S. government before the meeting. So this was the slides given to Xi, in my view, before he met with Putin on February 4th, where he announced this no-limit partnership. And then after I had given it to friends in the government, I then published a version of it, and I think on February 4th or something, yeah.
So my question is, and this is going to come across as a very wet and wishful question, but, to the extent that Russia's military performance has not been that impressive on the sort of hard power side, and to the extent that it does seem to have energized and unified something like the West in a way that maybe not everybody anticipated, has that changed the cost-benefit calculation? And I guess, an extension of that question is, would being shackled to a clear rogue state have bad consequences for China's aspirations to be a shaper of global order with support from, with a degree of consensus from the rest of the world, as opposed to overawing it with military power, which I'm not sure it intends to do anyway. I don't know if that was clear. But.
No, that's a good, and again, international politics is tough, as you know very well, and choices are difficult. And in fact, I argued at the time, and that's in the article version of this that I published, I said I would bet, again, this is on the basis of no classified information. This is all just basically inference and, spots of, but I would say, I bet at the meeting, the summit between Putin and Xi, she would have said, the timing of this is not convenient. Or sorry, let me go back one step. I had written a piece 2 weeks before this when Washington was saying Putin is invading Ukraine. And I said, Putin is not invading Ukraine before February 24th. So forget about it. And people said, oh, no. And Biden actually had called European leaders twice to tell them it's next week. Okay? And I'd said, no, this is not going to happen. And the reason why I said for sure, or not for sure, 4-1, so I gave 4-1 bets, was that the Olympics not going to be over till February 24th. And there's no way Putin is going to rain on Xi's parade. No way. People said, oh, you can't believe that. I said, well, you want to bet. So I collected a lot of money in Washington from people and others for this bet. And I published a version of it before. So you can go look at it in the national interest. So then you look and you say, well, okay, now they have this meeting on February 4th. Xi, what does he want this year? Stability. Why? Because the coronation is in November. He's going to become emperor for life. Okay? So this is not a good time for rocking the boat. Timing is not convenient. And besides, there's some unpredictability in all this. So I think he probably said, you know, this is not really what I would prefer. But on the other hand, you're a leader of a great power. You got to do what you have to do. And if you do what you have to do, I'll have your back. I think that's what he said. And I think that's what we're seeing. Now you look and you say, well, I didn't think you were going to screw things up this badly. And you think, Putin is a little strange, yeah? Russians are often screw-ups. A lot of the equipment they're using is equipment we bought. Now, of course, they don't take care of it as well as we do, maybe, but I've still, so, and I hear that the Americans are flabby, but their intelligence looks pretty impressive. Indeed, probably better than our intelligence when I'm watching what's going on. Because they've been sharing intelligence with us that our guys said were probably not right. I'm again making this up, and so I think they're having some second thoughts. And as you say, then we've already concluded that the Europeans are hopeless, and they're basically they care about trade more than they care about anything else. They'll do some moralism, but you don't have to worry about that. Lo and behold, they seem to have come alive. Now, again, I'm sure the Chinese are studying this, thinking, is this for real? You know, could the Germans seriously be rearming? You know, Putin has always said, what is among Russia's most important objectives? Certainly not a rearmed Germany. So maybe this thing is going in ways that we hadn't anticipated. And then I think particularly the thing that shocked the globalists in their crowd is, and it's shocked me actually, the extent to which the West is basically canceling Putin and Putinistas, supporting the Putin regime. So now if you're a global person, you can't go shopping in Paris or come to London to your apartment or ride your, ship around where you want to go or whatever. You can't send your kid to college in Kenya or, come visit in the US. Well, that's many of the leadership of China. And Xi Jinping has only one daughter in the world, and was his princess. Where did he send her to college? To Harvard. I mean, what? It seems slightly crazy. So now maybe that's not going to be possible. So I think they're having some second thoughts. And I think that's good. I think that the performance of the West so far has surprised me greatly. I think it's been a great success for the Biden team. They've done a great job pulling it together, but it's also been a great job for many of the European teams. But we'll see how it plays out. I think that, the game is not over, but if you were in playing the hand in Beijing now, I bet people are having more reason for second thoughts than they had, when they thought Putin was going to have this managed in a fairly, and I think most people actually, many, certainly myself, and many, many Americans that I know, underestimated the Ukrainian resilience and their determination and the performance of their forces.
Thanks, Graham. We already have quite a lot of online questions, but first I want to turn to a couple more questions from colleagues in the room. First from my colleague Nigel, and then my colleague. Nigel Inkster is a senior advisor here at the IISS, and he spent many decades as a keen student of Chinese.
I remember Nigel from China Studies, yes. Please.
My apologies for coming late.
No problem.
As Hirohito might have said, a doctor's appointment did not proceed in an entirely favourable direction. Got here later than I expected. I wanted to ask you, Professor, Dana just raised the point about a higher than anticipated degree of Western adhesion in relation to all of this. But the picture in the developing world, in the global south, looks rather different. There's a lot more ambiguity, and I wonder what your views are on the possibility of the United States and allies being able to actually engage more constructively with the global south and turn some of that around.
Well, again, you probably have some thoughts about this too, and I don't have any. So the, let me take one step back and then I'll, so Americans, and especially American government, I say we suffer from strategic solipsism. So this is worse than narcissism. So solipsism is so self-preoccupied and self-consumed that we basically think we're the only real actor and we act and everything else falls into place, almost as if our wish was others' command. So I think when we say the world has rejected Putin's aggression and atrocities, that's our talking point. And we say the talking point often enough. And then when you say, well, but in the UN vote, how many people voted with us and how many people sat on the sidelines? We say, well, everybody was with us. Then you say, well, but excuse me, the biggest country in the world, largest population? Well, no, China. How about the largest democracy? Well, they just haven't spoken up as. And how about the most innovative democracy? Israel. And how about Brazil? And how about South Africa? And how about, and you go around and you think, well, are they benighted? Or they haven't awakened? Or they don't have the same moral consciousness we have? Or what's the problem? So I think first Americans mostly don't even recognize your point that, so we just simply say, you know, everybody agrees, to which the answer is, of course, everybody doesn't agree. Now then, question, why not? So my colleague Larry Summers has a good line about this. He says that not everyone perceives our moral clarity as clearly as we do. So we have to tell them again, maybe louder. Okay, that would do it. So I don't know. I think it's an interesting puzzle. I think that for the Indians, in that case I've been watching quite carefully, as Jaishankar says, you know, we are unsentimental. By that he means we don't get all so excited the way Europeans and American moralists do. You know, we're interested in our interests. And for those that didn't watch it, I'd say go read Jaishankar's Foreign Affairs piece, which was a shocking piece to me, that he published a week before the 2+2 meeting in Washington that included a video summit between Modi and Biden, which basically says, you make all these claims about the international community. It's not true. So what's actually going on here, and whether we are, you know, sort of caught up in ourselves, I don't know. I think it's a puzzle. I think it's a puzzle. I don't think that, I mean, yeah, I do believe that Putin's outrages are outrageous. And I don't believe that requires, quote, a conception of moral superiority to come to that conclusion. But, and I don't think actually serious Indians or serious South Africans disagree with the fact that this is horrible, but I think they might well say, look at the conditions and circumstances that led to this, and some of those include things that the US did, and some inattention to Putin's interests, and they did, and so they would have a more complex, you know, picture of the situation. I think, you know, there's some merit in that, but I don't have a religion.
Yuka Kushino, research fellow here at the Institute.
Thank you very much, and thank you very much for your insightful talks. I had one question around the technology library. So you mentioned about 5G and AI and how China is outcompeting the United States and some other countries in some of the areas. At the same time, China had relied on talents from the United States or abroad, and also the links, the links to foreign investment in China, but also Chinese companies' investments in the United States. And that allowed China's kind of technology base to grow. And because of China's competitiveness, now we've seen sanctions from the United States and US commerce, for instance, including Chinese companies in the entity list. And then there's the strengthening of the foreign investments and export control, not just in the United States, but also with other Western countries and countries in the Indo-Pacific, like Japan is also kind of following that. There's a new concept of economic security kind of emerging, and also more in terms of the military front, we've seen AUKUS, which also has component of advanced military technology cooperation around quantum AI. So I was wondering whether that was in your perspective, do you think these kind of backlash from the Western countries, was it already folded in Xi Jinping's kind of calculation, or do you think this is kind of a miscalculation on Xi Jinping's side? And do you think the fact that China doesn't have as much access to the United States and other countries' technology base is going to bring China kind of more to the constraining or restraining mode of technology competition?
A good question, and you study this carefully, so I'd be interested in your view. But I think for a long, I mean, how did the Chinese advance technologically? The answer is in every way possible. So in Destined for War, actually, I write about, in the US, we have something called R&D. And they, as a Chinese colleague told me this, he said, we have something called RD&T. So research, development, and theft. Theft is actually the best way to get things because it's a lot cheaper. So how did they get their version of an F-35? Not spending all the money on research and development, just basically stealing the design. And if you can steal the design, that seems fine. Oh my God, how horrible is that? I mean, how did the US develop a textile industry? Basically, we stole it from the British. So historically, have-nots steal from haves, whatever extent they can, and haves try to hold what they can. But in a globalized world, extremely difficult to do. You can maybe ring fence a few technologies, but very hard to do. And if you look at the surge of Chinese talent in STEM arenas, 4 times as many graduates in high school, 4 times as many graduates in college, or 6 times as many PhDs, and now doing a lot of innovation themselves, trying to prevent a degree of diffusion. And since most of these are arenas that happen in the open world, so for AI, 90% of stuff is open. And trying to close it down, where are you going to put a fence around Google? You can't do that, or Microsoft, you can't do that. So the US will make things more difficult for China, and it is doing. And I think actually some companies will be severely handicapped. Huawei, basically their phone business was crushed, and their rollout of 5G significantly retarded by preventing advanced semiconductors. But overall, I would say that trend lines look pretty much, pretty much the way they are. And now, what to do about this? I think that basically, since I'm unambiguously and sort of part of the American team, so I wish. I mean, I compare this in these rivalry reports to Olympics. So there's the technology Olympics, the economic Olympics, the military Olympics, the diplomacy. I would like for the U.S. to win gold in every event. That's my ambition. But is that going to happen? Of course, that's not going to happen. So you're going to have a very fierce rivalry. So I would wish for us to win gold in enough of the events. Well, how to do that? Answer, well, now here's a list of complicated things. First, the U.S. has to get its own act together. Most of the problems the U.S. is having are inside our own borders. I mean, that's a hard thing to recognize, but most of our problems are inside our own borders. And those are huge, huge, huge. Secondly, we can recruit talent from all over the world. Again, I did a piece called the Million Talents Program, which is something Eric Schmidt and I are now pushing, trying to get Congress to do. I wish we recruited a million of the most talented people in all of the world and bring them to the US and give them their opportunity to do their thing. If you look at what's been the driver of American technological predominance ever since World War II, people not born in America. So now, is that good for the world? Well, that's a good question. I'm not so sure. I wouldn't like to answer that question, but is it good for the US? Yes, it's good for the US. So again, I'm pretty narrow-minded in that respect. And if you look, half of the unicorns the last 25 years founded by people not born in America. You look at the leadership of Google or Microsoft, or, most of the company, they're people that are, they or their parents were not born in the US. The US actually offers a fantastic opportunity for talent from all over the world to realize their possibility. So does the UK. And I mean, it's not by accident that, you know, some crazy, whatever, Mustafa Suleiman's dad was, I think, a Syrian who came to London to drive a taxi. And then he's one of the co-founders of DeepMind, and they make AlphaGo. What a wonderful world. Or this, you know, the BioNTech that's doing the vaccine with Pfizer. This is some Turkish couple who went to Germany and are having this. Oh, globalization can have some pretty amazing effects. I think the Chinese having a huge population of hugely talented people that are very ambitious and very eager are going to be a very serious competitor here.
Thank you very much, Graham. I'm going to take our first online question, which is from Bill Emmett, who is the chairman of the IISS trustees and former editor of The Economist. It says, Graham, many thanks for your very eloquent presentation. What would you be saying today if you were to be writing a briefing to Vladimir Putin on options for the war and for managing the aftermath?
Oh, my goodness. Bill Emmett, thank you very much. Bill Emmett is a great friend and colleague for many years. I wish we were back at the Greece conference we would go to regularly, and maybe with COVID as it lives, we'll get back to Crete. But in any case, thank you, Bill. That's a great question. Let me just think for 1 second. So if you were giving a briefing to Putin, so I think the first proposition is, he didn't need this one, but you cannot lose this war and survive. Well, I think he understands that. And I think, therefore, unfortunately, if he has to choose between losing and escalating the level of destruction, we should anticipate that he escalates the level of destruction. And secondly, how far would he go up the ladder of escalation? I would say to virtually wherever it takes. Certainly to include tactical nuclear weapon strike on a Ukrainian city. So I've worried a lot about that, and I think now the U.S. government is grappling with that, as you heard from Bill Burns lately, and even Zelensky had got this point. So secondly, what would constitute enough to spin it as a victory for Putin? And I think maybe if this current battle in Donbass is successful and they can have enlarged the hold they had on Donetsk and Luhansk, and maybe have this land corridor to Crimea, with or without Odessa. I think maybe if the Neptune missiles work as well as appeared, Odessa is going to be a much harder target than it would have appeared before. Since Putin has pretty good control of the story in Russia and has pretty good security system, I think he could make out some version of a victory there. Now, whether can Biden and the Europeans agree to some settlement with Putin, given the extent to which he's been demonized because he's actually a demon. I mean, I don't think demonizing a demon is, I mean, he's done more to demonize himself than we have, but we've jumped on. And Biden certainly has used all of the hot rhetoric that you could use, including genocide. So can you end up sitting down and making an agreement with such a guy? And in the current mood in Washington and most of Europe, the answer would be no. Well, I think as historians, we should look and say, excuse me, if Churchill and Roosevelt could make a deal with Stalin, and if Nixon could make a deal with Mao, get over it, you know? The answer is historically, if the choice is between continuing to kill people and dealing with a demon, you'll deal with the devil. I would say that'll be hard, but that's possible. If Zelensky wants to do. So then the question is, can Zelensky agree that Ukraine will survive as a rump, quote, or with having lost some portion of its territory for now, not permanently? He says no, but the answer is yes, I believe. Oh, I think he could end up finding a way to say, we never going to accept the loss of this territory, the same way we didn't accept the loss of Crimea. It's just that we're not going to fight about it for now, and try to build a Ukraine that would be a successful democratic market economy. And there I just, maybe this is seem like a searching for silver linings where we can find them, but I think I try to argue to a Ukrainian, I really do think this is right. Ukraine was not a very successful country before Putin. It wasn't a very successful country before Crimea, before the invasion in 14. It wasn't a very successful country before Putin invaded this time. I think the way in which the Ukrainians have emerged and come together, and their leadership has managed to articulate an identity, and they've shown themselves to be so brave and courageous, I think they're going to have a chance to build an impressive country. And because the West will feel invested in them, I think the Europeans and the Americans will provide very substantial support. So let's imagine the war got over, and let's imagine then Ukraine builds West Germany, and there's East Germany on the other side, or South Korea, and there's North Korea on the other side. You know, that'd be a great success story. And then over time, they maybe can recover the rest of their territory. I hope they could. But even if they didn't, they would have a successful country. So I'm hopeful, Bill. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Graham. Another question which follows on perhaps slightly from something you were saying. Question from Jeffrey Allen, who's one of our members. Dr. Allison, you suggested in your presentation that Russia might resort to using nuclear weapons in Ukraine. The use of tactical nuclear weapons by Russia would affect the entire international community. What does Thucydides say about deterrence and about the survival instinct of rising and ruling powers as a means of preventing calamity?
Oh, a good question. Now, Thucydides foresaw almost everything, but I don't think it included nuclear weapons. In my Destined for War book, when I'm doing the clues for peace, I say the biblical line, there's nothing new under the sun except for nuclear weapons. So I really do believe that Einstein got it right when he said nuclear weapons have changed everything except our way of thinking. And I do think that for people that have forgotten about it, because they thought nuclear weapons went away with the end of the Cold War or something, that this will remind us we still live in a so-called mad world. For those of us that lived through this before or have studied it, that means a world of mutual assured destruction, in which if you actually had a war, a nuclear war, between the US and Russia, at the end of the war, you could have no living Americans, and no living Europeans, and no living Russians. So you could actually kill them all. And when I worked for the Reagan administration, I remember we looked at the PSYOP, the plan for nuclear operations, in which we had even though we had a rule that said we were not trying to kill civilians, so we avoid civilian targets, we had 50 nuclear bombs exploding in Moscow. So every inch would have been disappeared, every inch. And I don't know about the PSYOP today, but I would say it's likely that in its full use, it would end up with a war in which countries would be erased from the map. So then what does this mean in trying to deal with a Putin who's nuclear armed and who might try to end this war by dropping, or by conduct, I think I've written somewhere, I think it publicly as well as privately, that, so could you imagine Putin, if he's losing, saying, okay, I'll conduct a tactical nuclear, maybe a 20 kiloton weapon on a small Ukrainian city. And then I'll say to Zelensky, is that good enough for you? Or would you like to see what a Ukrainian Nagasaki looks like? Now, that may seem like a horrible, grotesque comparison, but how did the U.S. end World War II against Japan? Excuse me, we dropped one bomb on Hiroshima. And then we dropped a second bomb on Nagasaki. The emperor said, okay, I got it. That's enough. Okay. So, is that conceivable? Unfortunately, it is. What to do about it? So that's why I'm more enthusiastic about getting this war over sooner, rather than later. And if this were to happen, would he have changed the whole international order? As Tom Schelling rightly said in his Nobel laureate speech, the nuclear taboo is one of the great accomplishments in trying to create international order. So for Americans or British or French, the whole idea of any use of nuclear weapons is, quote, unthinkable, other than in response to a nuclear attack. But for Putin, I don't know. And if he were to make a nuclear strike on a Ukrainian city, what would we do in response? I don't have a good answer yet.
Thank you, Graham. Another question from our online participants. I'm afraid I may be pronouncing their name IISS. I'll paraphrase it. Essentially about a power shift in Moscow. Is there potential, do you think, for some kind of regime change in Russia, which could see a more pro-Western or pro-US government in Russia? And if so, what's going to happen to the Chinese?
Okay, well, this is, again, we're all looking for silver linings. If I were a Russian, I think, and I know many Russians who have been part of the Russian government, I would be looking at this and saying, this is Putin's war. This is Putin's folly. This is Putin that's led us into this dead end. Putin is the problem. So I would wish and hope that Russians in the ruling class and around Putin would conclude that Putin is the problem and would find some way to do something about it. And if they were to do so, now, is Russia going to come back and say, oh my God, we're horrible and we submit and we'll live in American-led international order and let you do what you want to us? I would say that's a pipe dream. I don't think that's any. I mean, I was among those who was probably naive, certainly romantic at the end of the Soviet Union, in which I was hopeful that Russia would create a democratic culture. And I think it wasn't inconceivable. I think Yeltsin's desire to bury communism was genuine. And I think he made a very serious effort. I think if Yavlinsky, who had been the person I had worked with, had ended up, or someone like that, having become his successor, you could see a Russia on a very, very different trajectory, not one that would be, it would be a Russia that would want to be a great Russia. Russians believe that they're a great country. They have been a great country. They have a great culture. They have a lot to be proud of in their history. So I don't think they'll be, daubing their cap and saying, oh, we apologize and so forth and so on. But I think it's conceivable you could have a Russia that would become a normal country. I don't think there's something genetically or otherwise wrong with Russians becoming normal Europeans. But I think now it's going to be extremely, extremely hard. How you would manage in the after, again, the most likely outcome is if Putin were done in, that he's succeeded by Silovaki in some version that's not as crazy as Putin, but nonetheless will be uncomfortable. And then the question of whether and how they'll adjust to China. Xi has done a wonderful job of making Russians who are inferior feel equal. And Americans do a wonderful job of making equals feel inferior. So if we do as well what we do and they do as well as what they do, I think they'll keep them, yeah.
Thank you, Graham. A question from Andrew Orr, he's one of our members in Singapore. He said, what are the likely outcomes for satellites and proxies, e.g. North Korea and Syria? What are they likely to experience from the reduced attention and resources from their patrons if the economic and political climate persists? Do you feel there is any possibility of an unstable situation arising specifically in North Asia?
Oh, my goodness. So these are areas where I feel less confident, but I'll at least offer my impressions. So first on Syria, the reality is that Assad won in Syria. So Obama said Assad must go. Assad and Iran and Russia said, I think we'll stick around. And as Assad now says, Obama went and he's still there. So I would say that's right. And on the ground, I think the combination of Assad's forces and the Iranian backing and Russian help has been more successful than the opposition, plus whatever's help the U.S. and Israel have been providing. I don't see why that's going to change. In fact, I think the Iran story is one where both the U.S. and the Israeli policies have essentially failed. And Iran is in a stronger position today than it was 4 years ago or 8 years ago or before that. And I think that I wish and hope that there'll end up being some version of JCPOA 2, but I'm betting against that at this stage too. On North Korea, I think Kim Jong-un is, again, looking and saying, it's a good thing that I built a nuclear arsenal. It's a very good security blanket. Yes, you said you've imposed all the possible sanctions on me. I'm still doing okay. The Chinese are still providing me adequate degree of trade and support. So he may even be, you were saying at lunch, Ben, he could even be emboldened. If he now succeeds in conducting some more ICBM tests, and if he builds a reliable reentry vehicle for nuclear weapons, he may be able to pose a credible nuclear threat to American homeland. And if he could do that, and he sees Putin brandishing nuclear weapons to coercive effect, he may be emboldened. So it's, I don't think that I think that particularly if Putin were to use a tactical nuclear weapon successfully, the impact on global order, global nuclear order, is likely to be very, very, very negative.
We have another question from another Belfer alumnus, from Paul Freoli. It says, Graham, whenever I tell someone in Washington that I worked for you early in my career, he or she always wants to discuss the Thucydides trap. But many operate under the misunderstanding that your argument is that war between the US and China is inevitable, but I think you would say that there are structural factors that make war not only possible, but more likely than not. That's correct, and I think you've already discussed that. And Paul's question, which is something you've alluded to earlier, Graham, is what can be done by both sides to make war less likely? You said you've been thinking about this for some years. You'd had some ideas, none of which were immediately, how can I put it, big headlines. But perhaps you might want to talk a little bit about some general kind of directions of thought.
So thank you, and thank you, Paul. Again, another wonderful Belfer alumnus whom I had the great good fortune to work with, and who's now part of IISS, so part of your family. So first, your reminder to people about Thucydides trap is exactly right. So the argument in Destined for War is not that war is inevitable. So the book says in the first chapter, in the middle chapter, at the end, and then it says not, and still people will misinterpret it. Okay. So not inevitable. The fact that war happened in 12 of 16 cases would suggest that if it were simply a matter of statistics, which is not, but if it were, likely would be an okay word, but inevitable, certainly not. And if 4 of the 16 cases didn't have war, of course it's not inevitable. So, and the next to last chapter of the book tries to say, what can we learn both from the cases of success, like the Cold War, which never became hot, or like the rise of the US to rival and then eclipse Britain at the beginning of the 20th century. What can we learn from the successes as well as from the failures in order to avoid war? So the book is really about how to deal with an extremely challenging condition in which business as usual, or diplomacy as usual, or strategy as usual, should probably produce history as usual. And history as usual could be a catastrophic war. So that's the challenge, not to be fatalistic. Okay, that's to help define the problem. The book is really about the diagnosis of the situation that U.S. faces in dealing with China. Now, what to do? So if I were to pick the one of the 16 or the 9 avenues of escape, it's some combination of a Chinese idea of rivalry partnership and John Kennedy's idea of a world safe for diversity. So let me just take a word on each of those. So having survived the Cuban Missile Crisis, where he really believed there was a 1 in 3 chance he was going to end up killing 100 million people, of whom 10 million of them would have been Americans. Kennedy was a chastened and changed person, not normally reflective, but reflected a lot about what he had done, or almost done. And he and his brother were both Catholics, good Catholics, not good Catholics, but they aspired to be good Catholics. But they each believed they were going to have to give an account in the day of judgment of their lives. And Bobby, who was also not reflective, but still was afraid about this, said, you know, if we had killed 100 million people, there'd be no excuse. I mean, there's no way you can explain that away. So that was crazy. And it was crazy in some sense. So JFK gave his most important foreign policy speech, the American University commencement, just 5 months before he was assassinated. And he says in it, going forward, we are not going to be able to resolve our differences with the Soviet Union. But we have to focus on, quote, building a world safe for diversity, at the quote. And he meant by that a world as diverse as an evil empire, as he never gave up his convictions as a bona fide Cold Warrior that Soviet Union was an evil empire, and a good free world, which he never wavered on his notion that the US-led free world was a good. But nonetheless, in this rivalry between good and evil, we would have to build a world diverse enough for us to compete in that world without confrontations like the Cuban Missile Crisis, because as he said, we do this over and over. If there's a 1 in 3 chance of war, we're going to end up destroying ourselves. So how to have a world safe for diversity, but within which I compete. And the Chinese had a version of that, and the Russians, it's called peaceful coexistence. But in any case, the idea was we would never give up on competing with them. And ultimately, in the Reagan administration, Reagan got this completely. He would say a nuclear war cannot be won and must therefore never be fought. So how do we bury the evil empire but without a war? That's the challenge. And the answer is, well, we built a whole set of constraints, and we had very thick communication to prevent misunderstandings, and we even had compromises. So we agreed not to deploy ABM in order for them not to do it. So the price of getting you to do something that would be bad for me is for me to have to not do something I would have. We actually lived with the captive nations of Eastern Europe, evil as that was, and drove Reagan crazy. But the answer is, but if I were to try to liberate them, I would have a war, and a nuclear war cannot be won, so I can't do that. So how do I have a rivalry in a world safe for diversity, good and evil? That's what I want to end. The Chinese had an idea like this in the Song dynasty back about 1,000 years ago. And this is the Song were trying to deal with a northern tribe, the Lao, and they couldn't defeat them, so they ended up negotiating a treaty, the Chunyan Treaty, in 1005, and it called for the parties to become rivalry partners. So in some arenas, they would be fierce rivals. In other areas, they would be thick partners, and they managed this the same time. So I think the idea that we might have a competition or rivalry with China, in which we try to show, we the West, that political systems in which freedom is the core value, and market economies and a rule-based international order is a preferred way to deliver what human beings want than a party-led autocracy. And if we let this play out over a decade or 2 or 3, if we are able to make democracies work as well as we believe they should work when they're working well, not lately, okay? And if we believe that autocracies will fall victim to the problems of autocracy historically, and that actually inside of every chest is a heart yearning to be free, that human beings are made to be free, then this rivalry will turn out okay for us. And if it doesn't, then we don't deserve to win. That's my picture.
Graham, thank you. I mean, I have many more questions, and I know our audience does, but we've reached the end of our time. I want to thank you so much for coming and joining us here. It's been a pleasure, a delight and an honor to have you with us here, and we hope that next time you're in London, you'll come back to us again. In the meantime, I hope that my colleagues here can join me in thanking Graham for such a wonderful.
Thank you for hosting me, and I look forward to seeing you on the other side of the pond, but thank you for having me here today.